Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles program that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly show in which we talk about anything and everything that has to do with the Fab Four. It could be any part of their past, could be what's going on in the news. In fact, we do that quite often here on this show, or maybe even we look into the future with the Beatles. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the four regular co-hosts of the show. Some of you might know me from my other syndicated Beatles show, which is called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by my three other regulars. First of all, our musicologist, who writes for Beatle Fan magazine and a lot of other music publications, and for many years worked in the classical department writing articles for the New York Times, that being Allan Kozinn. Hi, Allan.
Hey, Ken. How are you doing? And hello, everyone.
Also a writer for Beatle Fan, who's been with them since the very beginning, that being Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
Also, we have Steve Marinucci, who for many years was the writer for Beatles Examiner. And Steve has a little bit of news regarding his status as far as a news writer in the Beatle world for all of us to hear. Steve?
Well, as has been announced, and I'm not breaking any news, Examiner is shutting down as of the 10th. Which means
of July,
which means I'm moving to other places. I'm not stopping writing about Beatle news, as I posted on Facebook and told everybody. I still have many miles to go, as the old saying goes, and I've got some ideas and some projects in the works that I will be talking about, in the future. But I'm not going anywhere. I have a blog, a Beatle Headlines blog, that if you see me on Facebook in my Beatles news group and on my page, I will be linking to, and I'll be linking in other places too. But I'll be doing that. I'll be doing some writing on Access.com still, which is related to, which is owned by Examiner's parent company, but obviously not nearly as much, I don't think, as what I was doing before. And not, as encompassing of all the other things I was doing before. But I'm going to still, I think, be doing some stuff for them. And there may be some other things, and I'll, like I said, when things firm up, I will discuss those and announce those here. But for now, I'm not going anywhere. So you're not getting rid of me yet, guys.
Well, like Steve said, he'll be sure to let us know, an update on his situation, all of his writings on the Beatles in particular, and we'll be sure to let you know right here on this show. All right. We also have a special guest with us on today's program, and that is Chuck Gunderson. Chuck is the author of the wonderful book called Some Fun Tonight, which deals with the 3 U.S. tours of the Fab Four. And this book came out in 2013. It's probably the most comprehensive book I've ever seen that deals with all of the shows that the Beatles did here in the United States. We welcome Chuck to our show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back on. I know I'm sounding like a transistor radio, but we're gonna be vintage tonight. And just think of you all holding up your Pepsi Cola transistor radio like Paul did in the Maisley Brother documentary.
Right.
We're doing this to give the show more of a 60s feel, like you're listening to the radio in the 60s.
There we go.
Right.
That's the real reason why we're doing this. Before we talk to Chuck about 1966, we thought that we'd talk to him since it is the 50th anniversary and the Beatles' U.S. tour of that year. We just have something that we have to note here, another major passing, not just someone who was an influence on the Beatles, but a major name in the music world, that being Scotty Moore, who was a great guitar player who's best known for his years with Elvis Presley in the early years, along with Bill Black and DJ Fontana, making up part of Elvis Presley's band and on so many of those early classic hits. I thought we'd all talk a little bit about Scotty Moore and what he's meant to music, and also to mix in a little bit of Beatle conversation in that as well. Al, you want to start?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, a lot of people forget, just as a little nugget of Beatle lore, the fact that Scotty engineered Ringo's Boku of Blues album.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And but more importantly, he was just a massive influence. I think Scotty Moore and Carl Perkins were probably the two biggest guitar influences on George Harrison. One could say that without Scotty Moore and Carl Perkins and probably Chet Atkins, George Harrison wouldn't have become George Harrison. Because he was such Scotty and Carl and Chet were such huge influences on his guitar style in the early years before he developed his own style. Particularly on those BBC recordings, he just absolutely shines. And a lot of that comes from the influence of Scotty Moore, who's and it's interesting that we're taping this on the anniversary of the day that Scotty and Bill Black and a kid named Elvis Presley made their first record at Sun Studios. That's All Right, Mama, which totally happened by accident. But he was just an enormous influence.
Yeah, he really helped to make that guitar solo part of rock and pop singles.
Exactly. Yeah.
He was kind of the start of that. I mean, you can't even imagine. We talked about guitar solos before when Henry McCulloch passed away with My Love and relating that to a song like Something from the Beatles. Try to imagine those Elvis Presley records without those guitar solos. And Heartbreak Hotel or That's All Right Mama or Jailhouse Rock or any of those records. It's just so much a part of those songs. Alan, your thoughts?
I don't know that I can say that much more than Al did. Al put it pretty succinctly. But I think also people were used to listening to the headliner on a record, which in Elvis's case would be Elvis, and just listening to the voice. But Scotty Moore was doing so much interesting stuff that you listen to those old records and it's hard not to have your attention rested to some degree and say, wow, listen what's going on in that guitar part. I think and I think that became also an important part of the sort of DNA that led into what the Beatles were doing. Not real showy necessarily, but important and atmospheric, and had everything to do with the song and what was being expressed in the song. And, it was really just a great stylist. And as Al said, and I guess we all agree, a very important influence on George Harrison.
Right. How about you, Steve?
I am such a big fan of early Elvis. And, Al mentioned That's All Right, Mama. When Sam Phillips released the song on Sun Records, they released on the record it said Elvis, Scotty, and Bill, and that was kind of. I mean, it wasn't just Elvis Presley, so, but he was a great guitarist that influenced so many people, not just far beyond the Beatles. I mean, I think Keith Richards said that when he first heard Scotty Moore, he wanted to be Scotty, not Elvis. So, there's just so many people, and it's so sad that, another great guitarist, at least we have his music, thank God, but he was just amazing. His work was just astounding. There's no way of getting around that. So
yeah. Chuck, you want to say a few words about Scotty?
Well, I think everything's been said about Scotty. I wanted to mention that I was at Sun Studios this past March, and you could just feel the presence of everybody that's passed through those sacred doors. But he was a life force in music. I mean, you're just, what can you say? But I think more than anything, Scotty was a true gentleman. He was like one of those Southern gentlemen. And that's what I really appreciated about him in terms of passing on his style so others could adopt it and go even further with it.
Yeah, I was thinking of, on all those early Elvis records, and those guitar solos are so great. One of the things that I think was to mirror what was to come in pop records was that guitar solos were short. They said so much in maybe 16 bars or something like that, maybe even less. And the Beatles, certainly, George knew how to craft that. He came up with so many great guitar parts in the Beatles, as did John and Paul, too. But I think that was also perhaps the start of that as well, to say so much with just a little amount of time.
Yeah. Matter of fact, there was a piece that Ken Womack wrote over the course of the last few days, which ran in the Huffington Post, and he talked about a visit that Scotty and DJ Fontana, Elvis's drummer, made to Friar Park to visit George Harrison in 1999. And they went over to George's studio and were jamming, and Scotty let George play his original guitar and all. And George asked him about his solo for Too Much, one of Elvis's singles from late '56, early '57. And Scotty said, I don't know. I can't even remember how I did that. And George said, that's okay. I don't remember a hard day's night.
Yeah. Also, there is a video that was made of Paul with Scotty and DJ Fontana doing That's All Right, Mama.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the DVD was called Good Rockin' Tonight.
Right.
But really good version. Sounds just like the Elvis version. Sounds just like the way the Beatles did it when Paul sang it. So that's a real fun thing to watch, which you can certainly see on YouTube. So yeah, very saddened to hear about Scotty Moore. All right, let's move on and talk about the Beatles' U.S. tour of 1966 with Chuck. I would just like to start the conversation by asking you, Chuck, before the Beatles came here in '66 to do their tour, obviously we heard about the horrors of everything that happened in the Philippines, where the Beatles were looked upon as snubbing the Marcos regime. And they also had to deal with the big controversy, overblown as it was, of the Beatles being bigger than Jesus quote from John. Do you think that U.S. tour, which really only lasted 2 weeks, was there any joy that the Beatles got from that tour? Because sometimes you get the impression that it might have all been, the Beatles just going through the motions. Or was it all misery for them because John had to answer to the controversy about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus from the very beginning, and they had to deal with all kinds of things like the incident with the Ku Klux Klan and all in Memphis. So was there any joy in that concert, do you think, from the Beatles, or was it the other way around?
Well, I think we need to put it in perspective, and I think a lot of times when we think about the 66 tour, it just goes on and on and on, and like the whole 1966 year was terrible. But in reality, let's go back to 1965 just for a moment. I mean, they had created, pop superstardom, being at Shea Stadium, and such success, could do no wrong, releasing great albums, lead the U.S. tour, finish up in the U.K., so really when 66 starts, I mean, it starts just like any other year. I mean, Brian is beginning to look at booking more tours and working on that. The group's working on more records. And, John gives the interview to Moore and Cleve in the early spring. And really, things didn't really start to go bad until the early summer, at least a little bit bad. I mean, you had the Butcher cover controversy. And then, the Cleve comments, although they were printed in the London Evening Standard in the spring, they didn't hit us until late July or something, mid-July, late July, when Data came out. So they really only had to suffer through a few weeks of kind of pain and misery. And, as you know, touring was starting to, make them wish that they were in the studio more. I remember one of them saying to Brian, are we going to have to do this touring thing every year? Is this going to be an annual event? So, later in the conversation, I'd like to present a theory, but we won't get to it yet. But yeah, I mean, this last little bit of time, the month or so that they were involved with touring, sure, it was fun when they're on stage. And it's always fun being cheered for and applauded. And anybody would like that. I mean, come on, if you're adulated that much. But I think for them, it just got to be, okay, well, what's more, what's bigger than what we've already done? And so there was really kind of nowhere to go. They've already been to the apex, and they were slowly kind of going down and being more interested in being in the studio. And that's where they went.
Right. I do remember you saying that, this was according to Bob Eubanks, that he felt that in 1965 he saw a big change in the Beatles by then, and so was 1966, to compare 65 to 66, yes, I'm sure they enjoyed being on stage and all, but were they just, because of everything else that happened that year, were they more just weary of it all?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were more weary of anything than just about the touring aspects of it, getting on the plane, of getting to these hotels and parking. They couldn't park on the tarmac and go to a regular hangar. They had to park way out in the airport area and had to get bussed in, and so the fans couldn't see them. It was just routine at that point. They would go to a venue, they would do a press conference, and even in '66 they limited the number of press conferences. In '64 and '65, they're doing one in every city. And then in '66, they introduced the press tapings, where they invited a few select journalists into their dressing room or hotel where they could ask questions. So they didn't have to face the monotony of answering the same questions over and over and over again. So it just became very routine. And, when you've been to the apex of your career, it's kind of hard to kind of look to the future and say, okay, what can we do live now that's going to knock their socks off and it's going to make us a lot of money? And I don't think there just wasn't any avenues to go to. They already went to all the avenues they could go to.
Right. Okay. Who wants to ask the next question?
Well, I was gonna say, Chuck, weren't they really getting tired of? They were getting basically pretty tired of the whole thing, and the '66 tour was pretty much kind of a real drudgery for them, because they endured all the crowds for all the crazy crowds and the whole Beatlemania thing, and as George said in the anthology, I mean, people just went mad, and they were all tired of it. And in fact, you can still kind of see, a little bits and pieces of that, the way Ringo and especially Paul and especially Ringo react to the Beatles now. I mean, that really left a lasting effect, and especially some of the things that happened on the tour. I mean, they played 5 shows in Japan, then the stupid thing in the Philippines, and then the Memphis, the blow up in Memphis. I shouldn't say blow up, but the situation in Memphis. I mean, this was not a great tour, not a great time for them as far as touring, right?
Oh, exactly. I mean, and it's really evidenced by the amount of shows they did over the last 3 years. In 1964 they were doing, I think they did around 250 shows or something like that. And then in 1965, they went down to like 78 shows. And then in 66, they went to like 35 or 38 shows. So it was already starting to happen after that first momentous 64 tour, where they did 32 shows in 33 days in the States. It was already starting to go. And, Brian was there as their manager, and he felt that touring was essential to keep them in the public eye. And so he did that. He booked those shows every year in January. He got with the promoters. He figured out the touring year. But I'm sure as he was booking shows that the group was saying to him, look, we love the studio. We love creating new music. We always love going forward. We don't want to be on stage playing songs from 2 or 3 years ago. We need to move and have more time in the studio, and we can't have that time if you're traipsing us all over the world. And I think the word world tour in 1966 is is a little bit misleading. I mean, look, they only went to West Germany. They played a few shows in West Germany. They do the Tokyo shows. They do the 2 shows in the Philippines, and then they end up finishing up in the States. Not so much of a world tour. But yeah, I mean, by the time they got to the States and after everything that happened, Germany wasn't so bad. There were some bad questions during the press conferences that they really were just answered really inanely. But by the time they got to Japan and the whole furor over the Budokan and you know, finally seeing signs of, well, not really finally, but seeing a lot more signs of Beatles go home and we don't want you. You know, suffering that whole thing. Then they go to the Philippines and do the 2 shows in the Philippines, which, can you imagine? I mean, it's July in the Philippines and they're up on stage in the afternoon. I can imagine the humidity and all that. They do that and the whole debacle with the Marcoses and getting out of the Philippines. They get back to London and George says we have a few weeks to rest up before we go get beaten up by the Americans. So yeah, they're sick of it. It's like, oh gosh, we have to get on that plane again and endure all this. And then all the stuff that happened in those cities. I mean, in Chicago at the start, you have the whole, you know, apology situation. You know, Steve mentioned the Memphis situation, the Cincinnati situation where they had to spend an extra night and then play a noon gig for the Beatles. That was like tearing those guys out of bed to go do a 12 o'clock noon gig. Can you imagine that?
Oh, wow.
St. Louis in the rain when they thought they were going to get electrocuted. You know, it's just, by the time San Francisco rolls around, they're ready. They're done. They're toast. They want to just go into the studio and progress.
Mm.
Yeah. Matter of fact, we I think you and I talked about this, Chuck, at the New York Fest, and well, first of all, you made the point in your presentation. I think a lot of people have the image that that entire American tour was in stadiums, and you made the point that it wasn't.
Yeah, even in 1965, people think that the Beatles only played stadiums after Shea. And yes, they played a few stadiums in 1965, but they also played, obviously, the Hollywood Bowl, which is an outdoor amphitheater. They played arenas like the Sam Houston Coliseum, Portland Coliseum, you know, things like that. But the difference is that Brian wasn't going to have them do one show in those type places, in the arenas and the outdoor amphitheaters. He's going to have them do 2 shows. So 66 rolls around, and it's like one more stadium more than, you know, 65. So, yeah, they were also playing Coliseum arenas in 66 as well, but doing the 2 shows.
Now, from a business standpoint, going into, because of all of the bad publicity, because of the Butcher cover and Manila, and at least what publicity there was from the demonstrations in Tokyo, and then of course the Christ situation. Was there any nervousness on the part of the promoters about the concerts, about, well, just from just a straight business standpoint, about them selling out, for instance?
Yeah, well, after the comments came out in Datebook, Brian flew from London to America, to New York, to give that press conference to talk about the statement that John gave and to kind of reassure the press that John had been misquoted. During that trip to New York, Brian met with a lot of the promoters, and because obviously the promoters were fearing that, my ticket sales are going to dry up. And I love Brian Epstein. I think he was a great manager. I'm always going to say this. He made a few, bad business decisions, but overall he's breaking new ground. He's all of that. And I think also Brian was a consummate professional and gentleman, because Brian had told the promoters, saying to them, look, you've been so good to us. You've supported us. Some of you promoters have been with us since '64, like the Ballard, the Ballards in Toronto, or Bob Eubanks in LA. If you've got stagnant ticket sales, let's reduce the guarantees. He was willing to reduce the guarantees. He changed some of the guarantees for a couple of the promoters. But Brian was prepared to cancel the entire tour, knowing that he would lose, a couple $1 million. He was prepared to do that. But the promoters said, no, let's do it. GAC, reassured the promoters it's going to be okay. Let's just continue on. But the 66 tour, at least the American side of it, was very close to just not happening at all.
On what basis would he have canceled it? Simply on if the promoters felt antsy, or was it about the Beatles' safety as well?
I think a combination of everything. Number one, the promoters not, taking a huge risk, because the promoters were paying huge guarantees, anywhere from $50,000 upwards of $75,000, $85,000 just for the guarantee. Plus, they were shelling out, 65% of the gross ticket sales as well. So, the promoters obviously, once August hit and the shows were 2 weeks away, they saw a significant reduction in ticket sales. Mm-hmm. And also, I think Brian was thinking about the Beatles' safety, obviously, and he loved them. He didn't want anything to happen to them, obviously. And so I think, safety was a factor, and I think maybe even the fan safety was a factor. This was a huge news event, and we see a lot of news clips of protests about the Beatles coming to their town. I ran into a fabulous cache of documents when I was doing the book about the Memphis shows, and about 3 weeks or so before the Beatles arrived, the Memphis City Council actually passed a resolution not welcoming the Beatles to their city and actually putting pressure on Early Maxwell, the promoter, to not hold the shows in Memphis. And it actually took a bribe by Early Maxwell to the mayor. His name was Ralph Ingram. I acquired his whole file, so I was able to go through it. But in the very back, there's a letter of donation, and actually it's post-dated to December of 1966, but it's a $500 donation to his campaign. But it was in his file marked Beatles. So my inclination is that he kind of greased the mayor's palms to let the shows go on in Memphis.
Wow.
That's something.
Chuck, did any of the shows in 66 sell out at all?
No. That's a great question, Ken, because the only show that ever sold out was the Shea show in 1965. A lot of the shows sold out in 64, but after Shea, no other show, American side, sold out in 1965 or 1966.
Wow. I knew some of them didn't sell out in 66, but I did not know that about 65. Wow.
Yeah, there was a show in my hometown of San Diego where they held it at Balboa Stadium on August 28, 1965, and they could have accommodated around 29,000 people, and they had an attendance of 17,000. This is, 10, 12 days after the Shea Stadium concert. I mean, you could have went to San Diego and walked up to the ticket office that day, that 5 minutes before the show, during the show, and got a ticket and could have got in.
For under $5.
What do you attribute it? Yeah. What do you attribute that to?
I attribute it to a lot of people think, well, gee, why didn't they sell out? Well, you have to remember, these are huge venues, and rock and roll was not a usual tour de force to sell out stadiums. Now, if the New York Jets were playing in the Super Bowl or something, they're going to sell out that stadium. But rock and roll wasn't selling out huge venues back then, and to attract 30, 40,000 people to a rock concert back then was, I think, a really high achievement to get that many people there, because it just wasn't like we know it today. You know, if you go see some of these super groups that can sell out stadiums. I'm thinking about this Coachella festival that's coming up, this 3-day festival out in California where, you know, Paul's playing and the Stones are playing and Roger Waters and the Who and these fantastic groups. And there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people there. So it's just, you just have to chalk it up to the times. In the mid-60s, I mean, to attract 30 or 40,000, that's a huge number of people to get to a music concert.
Well, Chuck, do you have data on the makeup of the audiences? I mean, you know, these shows today, people like us go to them and can afford prices of tickets and all of that, or some of us can. And in 1966, I think a lot of the audience might have been, you know, maybe 12 to 17-year-olds and maybe their parents coming and taking them along. But it was a fundamentally different kind of thing in terms of who was going to these, and that could also be why they didn't sell out. But do you have data on what the makeup of the audiences were?
The data that I had in doing the research for the book, where I saw literally, thousands of photos of crowd shots at different venues. You know, no one wants to have a bunch of crowd shots in a book. You know, I only included a few. But looking at these crowd shots, especially in different regional areas, number one, there wasn't a lot of African Americans and or other minority groups. It was mostly white America. It was mostly kids aged about anywhere from about 7 to 8 at the lowest, upwards into the high teens, early 20s. Maybe 1 to 2 parents, usually one. I had many fans that I interviewed, and they said, my parents dropped me off at Shea Stadium, and they told me they would come pick me up. You know, just those times, you know.
Yeah.
I had another girl tell me I lived in San Diego. I got free tickets to the Hollywood Bowl in L.A., and my parents drove me up to L.A. They dropped me off at the Hollywood Bowl, and they went down and had dinner on the Sunset Strip and came back and picked me up. And she was like 9.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was pretty much the demographics of Beatles shows. But, yeah, not a lot of minorities and older people.
And overwhelmingly female.
Yes, overwhelmingly female. Not like Paris.
Right.
Yikes, Beatles boys.
I think, you know, we hear. I know you've obviously seen the footage of Shea Stadium when fans are being interviewed and saying, you know, isn't it over with, basically, for these guys, and the fact that whole sections of the stadium were a little more sparsely filled than in '65, or you know, and I think if the Beatles were a normal group, which is the assumption that the press guys seem to be coming with, that could have spelled the end of the Beatles. Okay, no one's coming to these tours anymore. But I think it was probably because they weren't a normal group that they were at this point completely bifurcated between the studio and live, that assumption was, you know, not fulfilled, and the degree to which they were bifurcated, I think, is evident in the fact that their current single, Yellow Submarine, wasn't even in their stage set. You know? Well,
they never could have recreated Yellow Submarine on stage as well, along with, you know, Tomorrow Never Knows, or even some of the easy Got to Get You In My Life. They couldn't recreate that. They'd have to get a horn section on there.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, Alan. And the reason is what's really interesting is if you watch the news footage from the '66 Shea show where they're going around interviewing fans, there's kind of a shift almost in terms of what the fans are talking about. And the shift being is that the fans are talking about the music and how it makes them feel. Mm-hmm. It's not so much about seeing them live on stage. It's more about their music is great, it makes me happy, and if they keep playing music, they're going to be around for a long time. Mm-hmm. It's nothing. I didn't see any interviews where it's like, oh, I'm so happy to be here, and it's going to be so great to see him on stage, and I can't wait to see Paul and all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, you see all that in '64 with those interviews of the fans in New York, and I like George's eyebrows, and I think Paul's nose is cute. There's a complete shift in '66, at least with the news footage. I'm sure there was a lot of kids there, obviously, wanting to see them in person. But at least the kids that were interviewed were more talking about how the music made them feel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there any chance, Chuck, that the sales figures for each show might be somewhat inaccurate? Because if the stadium reports less sales than there actually were, maybe they didn't have to cough up more money?
You know what? Brian was very good. He and GAC, his tour company that he used, General Artists Corporation, those guys were sharp, and they carried along the tour with them accountants, and they collected the money. If they did 2 shows, they collected the money before the second show started. And I saw balance sheets from all the promoters as well as GAC balance sheets, and they all matched up. And I think Brian was very aware of what he was getting and what the stadium was reporting, and I think it was very accurate. There might have been some slushiness in terms of program sales, because you have to remember the only thing that you could buy at a Beatles concert was programs. That was it. They were $1.
Right.
You showed up, you bought your program. There were other people out there, but they were not authorized by GAC, or we hauled them out of there. But, you know, the only thing that was kind of slushy was the program sales, because there's accounts of Brian pocketing a lot of that money, that cash money that would come in those dollar bills for the programs. Some of the photographers mentioned that to me that were on the plane with them, that they would have like an old sack of money they'd bring out to play poker, and they'd use these dollars to play with. But it wasn't a lot, probably. I don't think Brian ripped them off. I think he shared equally with them just to have some fun with a little bit of slush money.
Okay.
But we know in the Philippines that the government, or whoever, the officials there, took most of the money that they made on those shows.
Now, it's very interesting that the last show was at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, because at that moment in time, there was a whole different kind of music scene emerging in San Francisco, and a little bit of that actually seeped into the promotion of the Candlestick Park show.
Exactly. I think the first thing, Al, is the poster.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, designed by Wes Wilson. I mean, a well-known psychedelic poster artist up there in San Francisco. So that crept in. And then also the promoters, which was Big Daddy Donahue, the other guy, Bobby Mitchell. Yeah, Bobby Mitchell, who ran Tempo Productions. And they were very cutting-edge, forefront DJs that were showcasing a lot of the new music that was showing up on the West Coast, especially in the Golden Gate, San Francisco era. But yeah, that was definitely there. There's definitely a vibe of that. And, when they were looking at doing that last show in San Francisco, the original plan from GAC was to do 2 shows at the Cow Palace again to end it. And after thinking about it, they were also going to do a show at the fairgrounds in Louisville, Kentucky, and Brian scrapped that. But the GAC said, let's just do the same format we've been doing every year. We'll do 2 shows at Candlestick, or at the Cow Palace, and we'll end it. And then GAC came back with a telegram to Brian and said, you know what? Candlestick Park's available. We can just do 1 show there, in and out, and be done with it. We recommend that you do Candlestick Park. So, there's so much lore about Candlestick Park and all of that. Wouldn't it have been interesting if they had said, okay, we'll do the 2 shows at the Cow Palace and be done with it. But I think they had some great memories of the Cow Palace, because that last show in the 65 tour to end it, which was the 31st of August, That show, those two shows, there's several photos in my book. I dedicated a lot of space to those last two shows in the book. It was wild. It was out of control. I mean, fans were on the stage. Fans were throwing chairs. Show, you see fans lying all over the stage. It was completely out of control. So GAC and Brian were smart. Hey, let's put him at second base at Candlestick Park. And I'm always interested, too, in terms of why did they put this huge circular fence around
I
it?
was just going to ask about that. Yeah.
They had never done that at any show. And the only way I can sum this up or think why they did that was it was the last show of the tour, and maybe they felt like fans would rush the field. I think there was just some extra precautions with that last show. I don't think the fans were sitting there thinking, well, this is the last time I'm ever going to see the Beatles. I don't think anybody knew on the fan side that this is going to be the last show. But I think they just put some extra precaution into that last, knowing, the fans knowing that this is going to be the last show in America just for that season. So they added that fence, that extra security. But it's just such a sad shot of them playing this enclosed fencing, almost like cattle, playing in there. Yeah, kind of a sad ending, actually, when you think about it.
And that place wasn't the most hospitable place. It was freezing at night. It was absolutely, having seen some night games there. And you probably got an inkling of, well, not really, because it was actually a mild night when we went to the McCartney show. But I attended some games there that were absolutely freezing, and apparently, from Paul's comments on stage, it was cold that night. And so it wasn't the nicest place to play, and so they were, that was another reason to get out of doing that stuff, so they wouldn't have to put up with that stuff, put up with those kind of conditions. I mean, you're talking about the rain, Chuck, and I remember that the one when they were in Holland there and it was pouring and they all had the umbrellas. I mean, oh God, that, you can only endure just so much of that stuff. And they really got it hard. I mean, that they really endured the worst of that stuff. Some of the, I don't know that anybody's ever, maybe Mark Lewison will eventually when we get the other books, but the real blistering of what Beatlemania did. I mean, it wasn't all fun, really, and it really. I mean, you can tell that it changed them. It really did. So
yeah. Well, I think, I mentioned at the beginning of the show about a theory that I have, and I'm hoping that Mark Lewison maybe, if he's listening, to bring this to light. But, every year, Brian kind of booked the whole concert year in the early months of the year, namely January. And we know in 1965, he had planned them to do some spring shows, he had planned them to do some summer shows, and he had planned to do some fall shows. So I guess the question I have is in the new year of January 1966, Brian's thinking about, okay, what are we going to do to tour this year? Because that was an ingredient every year, what they put in. And he said, okay, well, yeah, let's maybe go to Germany. We haven't, I'd like to go back there, or let's go back to the Orient. Let's go do this thing in the Philippines. We're going to come back to the States. But did he also add something in the UK in the fall of 66 and maybe presented it to promoters? In 65, they were playing theaters still, and after they had done this stupendous thing. So maybe there wasn't large venues in the UK you could go to. I mean, there was Wembley and things like that. But I kind of wonder, if he was planning anything for the fall. I'm sure when they played the NME show in May of 66, which was the last show in Britain they'd ever do, were they thinking, well, this is it, we're never going to play another concert in the UK? Or did they know that in the fall they were coming back and they had to fulfill some obligations in the UK in the fall of 66? I like to talk to Mark about it. to see if there was any kind of something in Brian's diaries or calendar or other businesses or other promoters that he had dealt with who will come out and say, well, yeah, I mean, they were going to do a show here in this town in October of 66 as part of this tour, but Brian called it off after the America because they just wouldn't go out and do it anymore.
Mm-hmm. But John was committed to How I Won the War for,
Right.
into the fall, and that started fairly soon after the summer tour, so he would have to have known fairly early that he wasn't going to have to go on tour and that they could then go into the studio in November.
Right. But he was done with How I Won the War, and they could have easily fit a 5 or 6 week tour in there.
Yeah.
Something to think about.
Sometimes I wonder if the Beatles knew before they started the U.S. tour of 66 that this would be the last, because there are those moments during the tour where they say in interviews that we'll be back next year.
Yeah, they do. And you really don't start hearing it. And, of course, all this is post-touring. You really don't hear about it until about the Candlestick show, hey, this is around the St. Louis show when, it was raining and they were loaded into a freight van afterwards and taken back to the airport, and they're rolling around in the back, and John or Paul finally saying, "Yeah, this touring is a bloody lark," kind of giving in to the other two, namely George, secondly John, saying, "We're sick of touring. We're done with we're toast. We're done with this."
Yeah. Chuck, you want to say a few words about the opening acts? One of the things that I love about your book is that you devote a certain amount of time to each of the opening acts from each year. So for people who wonder, like myself, how did Bobby Hebb become a part of this? How did, The Circle, bands like those, the Ronettes, how were they opening acts for this tour, and the Remains for that matter?
It was namely GAC, General Artists Corporation, that kind of put together the package show. And again, this is a different time, different age. When people went to rock concerts back then, you had to sit through a supporting show to get to the mainliners at the end. And as you know, the Beatles came on and played 30, 35 minutes. But they were generally selected by GAC. There's a couple instances where I know specifically that one of the Beatles asked for, a group. Like in 1965, Paul really liked Cannibal and the Headhunters. They had that huge hit, the Chris Kenner song, Land of a Thousand Dances. And he said, I want the Nana Boys on tour. We know when the Righteous Brothers quit in 1964, there was a booking agent that worked for GAC by the name of Bob Astor who asked his managed client, which was Frogman Henry, to join the tour. So it was namely GAC that kind of looked at who was making hits in America at the time and who would be popular. And look, the Remains were doing well. They were kind of this, I don't know, proto-punk band out of Boston, getting a slight following. Bobby Head had that huge hit in Sunny. I mean, everyone was singing Sunny, and of course the Ronettes, you can't beat them being on stage. So that's kind of that's how it kind of worked.
There were also
sometimes you wonder, in the case of the Ronettes, since the Beatles knew them, they met them in '64, if they had any influence in that.
Yeah, probably so, and also with the Circle as well, because the Circle was a Brian Epstein, Nat Weiss managed band.
Right.
So obviously, Brian's going to want to get the word out on the Circle and have him showcased. And they had two huge hits, Turn Down Day and Red Rubber Ball.
There were also some rumors about the Ronettes and the Beatles anyway. About some messing around going down there. So that isn't totally surprising either.
Yeah, and there's pictures of them on the plane with the Beatles, and they're very friendly with them. They're sitting on their laps and things like that. So
except that was the tour, I believe, that Ronnie was not with them.
Right.
Because Phil wouldn't let her go.
Right. Phil didn't want to let her go, and so she was replaced by Nedra Talley.
Right. So, oh well. I still would have. There are recordings of some of them out there of shows from that year, and they all sound pretty good.
Oh yeah, there's a complete show from Toronto that I listened to, all the opening acts and the whole Beatles show. It's not out, but I got to hear it, and it's amazing. I mean, Maple Leaf Gardens, horrible amplification system. But still, I mean, it was really good.
Is that the one that has the fan stuff too? Because if that's the one I'm thinking of, when it got auctioned, that got auctioned, I believe. And when it got auctioned, the auctioneer sent me highlights of it and allowed me to post it, and I did. And it was interesting. That was the first time I'd heard some of that stuff too. I don't know that I've heard the whole thing. But I heard a good chunk of it, as I recall.
Yeah, it's great. And then you also have to remember there was one instance during the 66 tour where it was in St. Louis, and with the rain and everything, they thought, hey, let's get the Beatles on stage. So the Remains open up. Bobby Hebb goes on after the Remains, and then the rain starts to really get menacing. And so they put the Beatles out next. And then the Circle and the Ronettes finished the show.
Wow.
Gary Tashi told me, he was of the Remains. He said that was the only standing ovation we got, but everyone's back was turned because everyone was leaving. They had seen the Beatles, so we had to come out and do our, we had to back the Ronettes, and everyone was leaving, and he said that was the only standing ovation we ever received.
I think the Memphis thing is interesting to discuss in light of the recent events about security situations. I mean, that really had to frighten the hell out of them. I can't imagine. A friend of mine was at that show, and he's told me what it was like, and he said, and you can just imagine everybody just freaking out. I guess they all looked at John because they all thought something had happened to him. But boy, that must have been frightening. That must have been just amazingly frightening.
Well, and if that would have happened in 1964, I don't think anyone would have paid notice to it. But in 1966, in Memphis, after you have the Ku Klux Klanman giving his famous interview on TV before he even showed up, and all the issues going on with the city council, with the religious leaders, with parents, and all of that. But if you listen to the actual concert, it happens when George is singing "If I Needed Someone." It goes off. Those guys are consummate professionals. They never missed a beat. They just kept going on. So I imagine they glanced at each other, briefly to see if anyone had fallen over, but they just kept on playing. And then you continue to hear the show like nothing ever happened. It's the craziest thing. They never mention it. Nothing. It's just kind of one of those things that happened, and they just, the band played on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but boy, in light of today, for example, like I said, I mean, that just must have been. I mean, they obviously didn't have the security that they do now, because obviously somebody was able to get through with firecrackers. But boy, wow.
Well, the show after that in Cincinnati was probably even worse, because, they're sitting there at the Crosley Field waiting out a rain delay, just sitting there, wanting to get this thing over with. They did not stay in Memphis that night. They hightailed it out of there. And so they were flying this late night flight into Cincinnati. They pull into the Vernon Manor. They get some sleep. They have to mess around Cincinnati in the hotel room. They can't go anywhere. They can't do anything. They can't see anything. Then they go to the gig. They don't do a press conference there. They do press taping. Waiting around all that time, to get in and get out, and then for it to be canceled. They have to hustle them back to the Vernon Manor. The Vernon Manor is not a great hotel. Okay, it wasn't a good part of town. It wasn't one of these really magnificent hotels. It's not like the Plaza or something. So, they're waiting around the next day, and then they tell them, oh, by the way, you got to get up early because you got to be back at the place at noon. Well, they're not showing up at noon. They're getting there probably about 11 because they had to get the support acts on and all that, but they still got to travel over there. They're probably up about 9 in the morning. Then they have to do this show in Cincinnati in the summertime. It's over 100 degrees, and the humidity's got to be 100%. They're under this tarp, which is the funniest thing because the promoter, was supposed to put a tarp on the night before, but he's too cheap. He didn't do it. And that's why it was canceled. So then they put the tarp on during a sunny, hot day. No one in the upper stands could have saw Ringo at all because he's under this tarp drumming. It was just a disaster. And then they leave the same day after that show and go to St. Louis by plane, and they have to do a show that night. Mm-hmm. So you can see how they're getting just sick of this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chuck, didn't you say, I thought there was an announcement on Facebook that Some Fun Tonight's going to be carried by a publisher, a major publisher?
Yeah, I just gave the title to them, Hal Leonard. They're a great group. They've been around for a long time. When you're an independent, I'm not like a Mark Lewison where I have a big publishing firm behind me. And when you're doing it by yourself, when you're doing everything, you're trying to get interviews, you're trying to market it, you're shipping the things yourself, you're doing all this stuff. And Hal Leonard approached me and said, hey, we're interested in your title, and would you consider it? And they gave me their pitch, and I liked it a lot. So basically, they're selling the remaining deluxe versions, which are the 2-volume hardbound set in the slipcase. There's only a few left, so if people want to get them, they need to go get them before they sell out, because those will never be reprinted again. But what they decided to do was offer a soft back version. Nothing's been changed. It hasn't been edited. Everything's still the same, but it is in soft bound. You're not going to get the glossy pages as it was in the deluxe version, but everything's the same, and you can buy each volume separately. So if you only want to get volume 2, which covers the 65, 66 tour, you can do that. And I know Amazon, I looked the other day, I think they're selling them for about $28. So it's a good deal. It's a good history and lots of good, hundreds of unpublished photos and memorabilia and documents. And, obviously I printed the documents really large so you could read all the fine print. So yeah, that's the deal. So you can get them much anywhere. You can get them on Amazon. You can go to your local bookstore. They'll probably carry them. So that's what happened. And I'm very, very happy that that's the way it ended up.
Will the paperbound version be the same size?
Yeah.
Will they be
same
the same size?
Everything.
Oh,
everything is the same. Yeah, everything's the same. Yeah, just a soft bound front.
Oh, good.
Will you have copies of either version at the Chicago Fest?
The soft bound version won't be released till September 1st. But I will be at the Chicago Fest selling my remaining deluxe versions, which I think I only have about 30 left that I'll be selling there. So if you want to get them, you better get them, because I don't think I will be appearing at the New York Fest next year with hardbound versions.
Oh, okay.
So get them while they last.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Chuck, we're pretty much out of time here. This has been absolutely wonderful having you as a guest again. And kind of like, on Saturday Night Live, they have that, was it the 5 list of people who have co-hosted the show? I think you've been on the show now three times. So
yeah,
probably.
We did all 3 tours, which was great. So if you want to concentrate on a particular city or something, we can do that, because every city they went to, I guarantee you, there's a great story behind it.
We'll
get even more specialized. Yeah.
Chuck,
Yes.
you're doing. I know, and this is going to kind of coincide with when we publish it, so it may happen before we get on. This thing gets on the internet, but you're doing a program at the Grammy Museum in Los Angeles. But I'm wondering, where else is the exhibit going
we just opened up at the Grammy. That's the Ladies and Gentlemen, the Beatles exhibit, which is a part of my group called Fab Four Exhibits. And we've been touring for the last 2 years. It's a large-scale Beatles exhibit that tells pretty much the American story, arrival JFK, February, but we do go into the early period, but we end about 66. So that's been touring for the last 2 years. We just opened up at the Grammy Museum in LA. It's a smaller version of the exhibit, and it will be there till about, I think, the 5th of September. And then we go to the William J. Clinton Presidential Library beginning in September.
Wow!
And we'll be there till April. And from there, I'm not too sure, but at least you're covered until next spring if you want to go see the exhibit. It's amazing, the artifacts, the story. We finally added a new artifact in Mississippi. We have Ringo Starr's Hard Day's night suit, the complete suit. Russ Leese showed it to me at a local Hampton Inn. He just unzipped it and laid it on the bed at a Hampton Inn in Mississippi, and I'm looking at this thing going, wow, because it had been the first time it had been seen by the public since Ringo wore it in Hard Day's night.
And then you're doing something, again, like I said, by the time the show comes out, it'll probably be done, but you're doing a live thing with Bruce Spicer and somebody that was at the Sullivan Show at the Grammy Museum this week, I believe, isn't it?
Yeah, this Thursday I'm going to travel up to the Grammy Museum. I'm going to give some private tours of the exhibit both Wednesday and Thursday. So if anyone's interested, then call the Grammy Museum and get a ticket for that. But the symposium is Thursday night at 7:30, along with Bruce, Russ Leese, and myself, Bob Santelli, the executive director of the Grammy. And also someone that went to the Sullivan Show. And before we leave, I'll also add one other thing, is that the Ron Howard documentary is coming out very soon, and I've seen the complete version of that.
Ooh, wait a minute! You can't. We're not going to
mention this earlier.
Yeah, we're not going to get away without talking about that. No, what did you think?
Well, I can't say anything because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. I'm an honest guy, and I'm going to keep to that. But I have helped them quite a bit on the documentary with the history, with artifacts. They've used my book, obviously, for the U.S. part of the documentary. But yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it in total, and I'm anxious for it to come out.
I was going to ask you, since the exhibit's going to the Clinton Museum, is the former president going to have you had any contact with him at all?
Well, that would be interesting. It's not on their website. It hasn't hit their website yet. I think they won't do any pre-marketing for that until about, I'm thinking, late August. Mm-hmm. So if I get a call from a Secret Service agent or something, then I'll know something's going to happen, I guess. But, so I don't know if President-elect Clinton will be there. I don't know if Bill will be there.
Who knows?
Really.
An inauguration invite?
No, if I get frisked at the door, I guess I'll know what's happening. So
yeah,
right.
That's true. Well, good luck with that.
So that'd be interesting. It'd be fun. Yeah, it's a great. We were at the LBJ library. We set the attendance record there for any other exhibit, including LBJ exhibits that have ever been there in that museum.
Huh.
The Beatles exhibits.
Wow.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we had a great experience there. So hopefully the exhibit can continue. We're kind of running to an end of our contract with the Grammys. It comes up after the Clinton. So I know they're interested in renewing it, but we have to see if we want to continue on with them.
Okay. Well, good for you.
But it's been fun.
Yeah.
Well, Chuck, this has been, it's been great having you as our guest. Yeah. And, of course, we welcome you on whenever you want to be a guest on the future. Just, let us know. There's so many things we can talk about as far as... or pick a city, like if they showed up in New York, 3 years in a row, there's a lot to talk about, or a particular city.
The New York thing would definitely be interesting.
If any of our listeners want to get in contact with you, Chuck, how can they do so?
They can get in contact with me through my Facebook page, which is the Some Fun Tonight page, or they can get to me through my webpage on the book, somefuntonight.com. They can email me at gunderson910@aol.com. I'm still one of those old AOL guys who will never give up, I guess. It's going to be vintage one of these days, I guarantee it. Yeah.
And as for the rest of us, Al, if people want to get in contact with you,
Facebook, Al Sussman, on Twitter at ASUSS49, through Beatle Fan Magazine, www.beatlefan.com, and www.paradingpress.com for Changing Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation.
Okay. And how about you, Steve?
My email address will not be changing. It will always be Beatles, or for the time being, it will be BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. You can catch me on Facebook under my name, and in my my Beatles group, Beatles News and Commentary. I also want to mention that the show is available besides Podbean on YouTube, and it's also on iTunes, so you can find us all over the place.
That's right. And if you want to send us an email to the group, our email address is thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We also have our own Facebook page at Things We Said Today. And on Twitter, you can reach us, Steve.
Things We Said Fab.
Okay. And as for me, Ken Michaels, my website is kenmichaelsradio.com. You can always email me directly at everylittlething@att.net. And don't forget, on my website, there's weekly Beatles trivia, and you can win the brand new compilation of Pure McCartney. So, Chuck, it has been great to have you here on the show. And
thanks again.
On behalf,
thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
And on behalf of Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, Alan Kozin, Chuck Gunderson, and myself, Ken Michaels, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.